100 ppm of CO2 cannot change the global temperature 21 Fahrenheit. In the last century, the claim is we've risen 1.2 Fahrenheit in 100 years. And what change in CO2 has there been? 100 ppm. So even if we believed all the nonsense, 1 degree Fahrenheit's all we're going to get, not 21. Physics prohibits it. The other big deal is when the scientists who gathered these cores looked at it in detail, they found that, in fact, the temperature changed up or down 800 years before the CO2 changed, which means temperature drives CO2. CO2 does not drive the temperature. Another false claim here, Antarctica is melting. Heard that. Had seen pictures and shows all claiming this. How can that be? Antarctica is in fact cooling and their ice is growing down there. Well, here's what's going on. The people doing all the claiming and researching are standing out here on the Antarctic Peninsula here, surrounded by water, which makes a very unique and strange microclimate, it's called. That is in fact melting back a little. That represents 2% of Antarctica. There's a little bit of melting here along the seacoast here on the west side. That's some melting. But all of the rest of this, all those plus signs, are growing ice in Antarctica. That's 80 to 90% of Antarctica's area is growing in ice. The average, we're adding ice, we're staying about the same. There is not a problem with Antarctica melting. And it should be if CO2 warming is occurring, because CO2 will make the poles melt first. Another false claim, the glaciers are all melting due to global warming. Some are. Some are growing. Some are stagnant. Now, where did I get that information? Another world expert, Dr. Roger Braithwaite, expert glaciologist, published a paper in a peer-reviewed paper in an academic journal, Progress in Physical Geography. He said in that paper, 160,000 glaciers exist. 60,000, we've done some minimal inventory. 79, and only 79, do we actually go in and have measured these things to know how much ice is there for 5 years or longer. That's the only place you could get any science about glacial melting. But these 79 out of 160,000 glaciers, what does he conclude when he goes in and looks at the data on these? No obvious common global trend of increasing glacier melt in recent years. Conclusion to that journal article. Bye-bye another myth. So, what I've walked through tonight, oops, sorry, must have hit a wrong button there. This thing is fast. Is I've established 4 things for you that you need to walk away with. There's no scientific consensus on the global warming crisis. Top science experts worldwide are the skeptics. The crisis data and models are invalid. That's all it's got, surface data and models to rest on. The temperature data shows a global cooling period began in 2001. We could see that on Dr. Spencer's plot. And natural variations, from variations in the sun and variations in the oceans, are controlling our global temperature. The alarmist claims are ideological lies. They have no scientific foundation. If anyone has any questions about that in the Q&A, we'll talk about that later on.
Environmentalism that's come out this month, which I'm quite proud of. I looked at this article with a certain, from a certain point of view. I asked myself a question: can a non-scientist, and I'm not a physical scientist, I'm in a Department of Political Science. I have a classics background. My PhD is in classical studies. My first 2 books were on ancient Greek lawgivers, ancient Greek politics. I have a new book coming out in the spring on military history. And I asked myself a question, because I saw what was happening in Washington. Can a non-scientist look at these kinds of issues and look at the politics, look at what's happening in Washington? Can I make a rational judgment on these issues, or must I remain a skeptic? Must I just go along with this kind of thing because it's all too complicated to understand? And I came to two conclusions about this. The first conclusion was this: if you hear one of these global warming or global alarmist people tell you that this is all too complicated for you to understand, therefore you need to go along with them, then you need to look them in the eye and say, if it's too complicated for me to understand, then don't ask me to agree either. Right? Because if it's too complicated for you to understand, then it's too complicated for me to agree. And if you think that I'm supposed to take you on faith, because you say so, then you might be talking some form of religion, you might be talking some form of political consensus, but you're not talking science. If it's too complicated for me to understand, then you have no right to ask me to agree. And then the second point I realized is that it's not so complicated that I can't make a rational judgment. It is very complicated. You start getting into things like solar analysis, what the solar scientists do. This stuff is deep, and I don't understand it, and I don't pretend to. You start getting into climatology. I don't understand it. You know why? Because nobody understands it. The entire science is in its infancy. Reed Bryson, I believe is his name. Is that Al Gore's teacher? Paul, where are you? Is that Al Gore's teacher? I believe that is his name. Al Gore cites him as turning him on to all of this and being the man who got him, so concerned with the fate of the earth. And he published an article and said, no, we're not going to know enough to make a judgment on this stuff without at least 30, 40 more years of study. He knows that this is not. That it's not possible to make these judgments yet, because the science is in its infancy. So I looked at it from the point of view of the natural history of the earth, and I looked at it from terms of the history of the movement itself, and asked whether I could make a judgment, and I formed the conclusion that yes, I can. I make a judgment this is all nonsense. It is driven by ideological reasons, not by scientific reasons, and it is driven by a political socialist purpose, not by a scientific purpose. And there's another level to my judgment about that I think is important too. Even if I were to come to the conclusion that we human beings from our industry were in fact about to cause a global climate disaster, and let's be clear about what I'm talking about here. I am not talking about whether or not we are going to cause a 1.18 temperature, 1.18 degrees Celsius temperature rise over the next century. We're talking about people who are saying we are going to face a global climate disaster that's going to destroy us. That's what they're saying. We're talking about a global climate disaster. Even if I were to form the conclusion that our industry was going to cause a global climate disaster 50 years from now, I would not be arguing for the government programs that they're proposing. Why? Why not? The answer is obvious, because if we were causing such a crisis, what would we need to get out of it? Freedom, innovation, people thinking, people working, industry working on the problem. Who would you want solving the problem? The post office? Right? Read about the cost overruns on the F-22 Raptor and ask yourself if you'd even want the Pentagon working on it. Right? The state of it is, the Pentagon is in its own crisis right now. I don't trust the Pentagon to defend the country any longer. Right? Who would you, if we were causing that crisis? So in fact, we can make a political judgment apart from the scientific judgment. So these are the conclusions I came up with after burying myself in this stuff last year to come up with this article. Now, what's going on in Washington right now is a plan, a motivated, highly motivated plan for a massive set of institutional infringements on our rights of a level and degree, I think, unseen in the history of this republic. There's really two distinct programs out to do this. One is the socialized medicine plan, which if it were to pass as Obama wanted it, would destroy healthcare in this country. That's another subject. But the other is the EPA plans.